The classroom shimmered with sterile light as the students filed in, their various limbs and appendages adjusting to the cool atmosphere of the Galactic Diplomatic Academy. There were no whispers, no idle noise, only the low hum of the environmental stabilizers and the shuffling of robes and mechanical limbs as they took their places. The gravity had been adjusted for the comfort of the majority species in the room, though one could still sense the faint distortion field trembling beneath the floor, a reminder that this was a place of order and equilibrium. At the center stood Professor Zorin, his long fingers clasped behind his back, his 6 eyes dim with thought. Normally, his lectures were structured, formal, and delivered with the same mechanical rhythm that many of the students had grown to depend on. But today, something was off. He hadn't activated the holo projectors. He hadn't loaded any simulations. He hadn't even greeted them. He just stood there, motionless. A Telari student with iridescent scales broke the silence. "Instructor Zorin, is today's lesson postponed?" Zorin blinked slowly, once per eye, then stepped forward. "No. But it is different." His voice was lower than usual, as though weighed down by something unseen. "Today's subject is not officially permitted in this sector. I advise anyone who is unwilling to carry the burden of knowledge to leave now." No one moved. Curiosity held them in place. Forbidden knowledge always drew the ambitious. Zorin exhaled. "You have studied the major conflicts of the galaxy. You have analyzed strategy, diplomacy, and the ethics of war. But there is one species whose military participation is conspicuously absent in modern curriculum. A species that once served in every major frontline engagement across 3 quadrants. You all know the name. Humans." There was a stir. One student muttered something under his breath. Another glanced at her datapad, trying to verify if the term had even appeared in previous modules. It hadn't. Zorin raised a hand and darkened the room. A single beam of soft light formed above his console, revealing a file interface that hadn't been opened in centuries. "I do not share this out of defiance," Zorin said. "But because you asked a question no one dares to answer. Why are humans banned from galactic war?" The file flickered, and audio began to play. It was static at first, low and cracking, as though the signal had come from a deep time well. Then, a child's voice broke through. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are." There was no melody, just the words. "Fragile. Human. Up above the world so high." The voice trembled on the edge of innocence and fear. "Like a diamond." A blast. Sudden and deafening. The recording broke into shards of screams, alarms, and metal tearing. For a full second, nothing else played. Then silence swallowed everything. A student flinched. Another closed his 3 eyes. Zorin waited until the silence had settled. That was not a battle. That was a child's memory. No one responded. "In the era of the Federation expansion," Zorin continued, "humans joined the galactic community with enthusiasm. They offered aid, technology, and diplomacy. But the moment they entered our wars, things changed. Not because they used superior firepower, but because they brought something none of us understood." He leaned forward slightly. "Emotion. Purpose. Sacrifice." The room remained silent yet heavy. The students weren't ready for this. But they would not leave now. Zorin's fingers hovered over the console again. "I will show you more later. But today, I need you to feel what you've never been taught. I need you to understand not what humans did, but why they were removed." Another student, a thin, avian-like creature with polished feathers, raised a trembling claw. "Was that child part of a military log?" Zorin turned toward the student. "She was the daughter of a medical officer stationed on an Earth colony ship during the siege of Eno 8. The ship was not armed. The humans on board were not soldiers. They were volunteers." He paused. "When the vessel was intercepted, the enemy didn't expect resistance. They expected fear. What they found instead was a crew of humans who disabled enemy drives, transmitted evacuation coordinates to civilian refugees, and locked themselves inside the reactor core, triggering a localized collapse that took out the invading fleet. No one spoke. That child's recording, Soren continued, was recovered from the emergency buoy. She sang as the ship fell. She sang because her mother told her the stars listened to brave children. The room felt colder than before. I share this not to glorify them, but because you cannot understand their banishment without first feeling the weight of what they carried into every battlefield. This was how they fought. Not with superior weapons, but with the unbearable weight of choice. And they chose to stay. Again and again. He closed the file. The beam of light faded. Another student, younger, whispered in the back. Why haven't we been told this before? Because, Soren replied, turning to face them all. We were afraid. Not of their power, but of what we saw in their reflection. That war was never just about victory for them. It was about meaning. And when you fight with meaning, you don't lose. You become unforgettable. There was a long pause. Then the professor walked toward the sealed chamber at the rear of the classroom. He placed his hand on the biolock. I will show you what came next. But I warn you, nothing you've studied will prepare you for how humans fought their last battle. And just before the doors hissed open, he said one final thing. Remember that lullaby. You will hear it again. Not in data, but in your thoughts. Because humans never leave a battlefield. They just become part of the silence afterward. The records from the war archives were once sealed under the highest Galactic Council authority, deemed too psychologically corrosive for academic use. But they weren't deleted. Deep within the restricted logs lies the classified history of Operation Daggerfall, the final recorded military deployment involving human combat forces. The operation was never publicly acknowledged, but its consequences shaped centuries of interspecies law. The details are brief, clinical in tone, and brutally effective in revealing a pattern of warfare that no other species ever replicated, much less understood. Operation Daggerfall began as a joint response to the incursion of the Vorish, a species that consumed entire planetary biospheres to feed their organic superstructure. Their fleets were endless, their motives incomprehensible, and their language consisted only of radiation pulses and entropy-based signal signatures. The Galactic Council authorized an alliance of over 30 species to engage them. Losses escalated rapidly. Worlds were extinguished in days, their populations swallowed into silence. Then humanity volunteered a specialist unit known as the Ghost Division. Officially, the Ghost Division was a myth, unregistered, unaffiliated, and rarely seen. They didn't rely on centralized command. They didn't wait for logistics. When they entered the war, they didn't bring ships, they boarded the enemies. They weren't trained like other soldiers. Their methods blurred the line between survival instinct and tactical madness. They used environments, corrupted enemy code, and applied psychological disruption tactics that induced fear in Vorish swarm logic, something previously thought impossible. They didn't merely fight battles. They broke the enemy's understanding of combat itself. What makes the record chilling isn't just their tactics but their willingness to accept total casualty probability in exchange for victory. On the planet Hesselin 3, the Vorish infected the atmosphere with nanofog designed to convert all carbon-based life into biomechanical tissue. The Council ordered evacuation. The Ghost Division deployed instead. They uploaded viral poetry into the nanofog's code, poetry. The transmission began with a human suicide note, one composed not in desperation, but as a tactical weapon. The nanofog, now compromised by recursive metaphors and paradoxical logic, turned on itself. The atmosphere cleared in minutes. No ghost soldiers survived. This was not anomaly. It was consistency. Other species recorded statistics, deployments, kill counts, fleet positions. Humans documented final letters, enemy reactions, dreams before combat, and what smells reminded them of home. The disconnect between how they recorded warfare and how others did was not cultural, it was surgical. They did not separate the soul from the mission. It made them ungovernable, unpredictable, and dangerous to the very structure of galactic law, which had been built to contain and categorize all forms of conflict. The Vorish changed tactics because of humans. They became erratic, even paranoid. They stopped consuming worlds that contained humans. They began to avoid human-occupied systems. Some scholars argue the Vorish had no concept of fear. That changed. Not because humans used better weapons, but because humans were willing to die in ways no other species could comprehend, without glory, without certainty, often without orders. They died with intention. And that made them horrifying. In their final documented engagement, the Ghost Division infiltrated the Vorish hive mind nexus, a structure that pulsed with energy greater than any star. They did not destroy it with force. They turned it against itself by simulating a memory loop so emotionally charged it destabilized swarm cohesion. What memory? A recording of a human medic whispering the names of fallen comrades while trapped in an airless crater. She wasn't giving commands. She wasn't sending data. She was remembering. That memory caused the Vorish to split into factions, attacking each other in confused agony. The hive mind collapsed. So did the Ghost Division. None returned. What followed wasn't a celebration. It was silence. The Galactic Council didn't know what to do with the aftermath. The Vorish were halted, but the method disturbed every cultural and moral pillar the Council stood on. Peace was restored, but not understood. That scared them more than the Vorish had. And so, by unanimous vote, the humans were banned, not as punishment, but as containment. They were not exiled for losing control. They were exiled because they had mastered it to such an extent that it exposed everyone else's lack of it. Their victory didn't inspire admiration. It made the rest of the galaxy feel obsolete. Classified materials described the psychological aftermath of their presence on Allied soldiers. Sleep disruption. Existential dread. Reversal of empathy algorithms. Some began to adopt human rituals without understanding them, singing, writing names, carving symbols into armor. When interrogated, many could not explain why. One Grelian officer wept uncontrollably after repeating a human phrase. Hold the line. He had never seen a human in person. The ban was quietly passed. Humans were restricted from combat deployment. Even simulation environments were locked from their access. The Council fabricated records of instability, claiming humans had become too volatile to serve responsibly. But the truth, encoded in the black files, was simpler. The Council feared what might happen if humans fought not just to survive, but for something greater, something like love, legacy, or even just a child singing into the dark. To this day, memorials to Operation Daggerfall remain incomplete. Not because no one remembers the names, but because no one understands the sacrifices enough to carve them properly. Their story ends not in triumph, but in mystery. Some believe a few Ghost Division members still exist, watching from remote systems. But if they do, they haven't returned, not out of fear or shame, but because they know the truth. Humanity was never banned because they were dangerous to others. They were banned because they reminded everyone of what it meant to be truly alive in the face of death. And no civilization, no matter how advanced, can afford to remember that during war. Because once you do, you stop seeing war as strategy, and start seeing it as a tragedy you never want repeated. The alien students had never seen Earth. Most had never met a human. Their opinions were shaped by secondary material, biological charts, economic graphs, outdated footage from cultural exchanges long discontinued. The Galactic education system, governed by the Council's Bureau of Sentient Affairs, ensured humans were footnotes in galactic history, clever but erratic, innovative but emotionally unstable. They were framed as a species that had peaked early, then voluntarily receded. Students learned phrases like emotional volatility and reactionary thinking to describe them. None were told the truth behind the ban. Until now. Their instructor was a Cavern scholar named Iartel, known for pushing the limits of curriculum law. Today's lesson deviated from protocol. No screens, no official documents. Instead, he played a single audio file labeled only with a numerical timestamp. It began with ambient static. Then a human voice, female, weary, soft, speaking what seemed like a private message. If this reaches anyone, tell my daughter I remembered the sound of her laugh even at the end. And I wasn't afraid. The room fell silent. Even the species with no concept of parenthood understood the depth of what they had heard. That wasn't a military recording. It was a confession of love spoken into oblivion. Tell explained nothing. He simply followed it with a question. Why would a species so feared be capable of this? One student, a Yalan technician, responded with a data-based hypothesis about psychological bonding. Another suggested it was an anomaly, one soldier under duress. But one student, a Zorinthian named Cavell, asked the question no one wanted to voice. What if that's why they won? What if that's what made them impossible to defeat? The class was assigned restricted research, real reports from the pre-ban era, some still fragmented. They found letters written by dying human soldiers with no tactical value, recorded only so that others might feel less alone. They uncovered transcripts of human units arguing not about strategy, but about whose turn it was to write home first. In a conflict where most species relied on cold efficiency and distributed logic, humans relied on their capacity to hurt, and still choose to act. That level of internal contradiction, of emotional defiance in the face of certain death, wasn't weakness. It was the engine of something else. Something far more terrifying. The alien students found patterns. In every battle involving human forces, outcomes deviated wildly from statistical predictions. Not because of superior firepower or technology. Humans were often outgunned and under-equipped, but because they made choices no model could anticipate. They initiated attacks after defeats. They held positions long after evacuation orders. They sacrificed winning positions to rescue non-combatants. These weren't errors. These were deliberate, rooted not in strategy, but in conviction. And that made them volatile beyond calculation. Their education had taught them that all sentient behavior followed patterns of utility. But humans broke that. Humans fought when they should flee, endured when they should break, and loved when they should have shut down. Every alien species developed warfare from logic trees. Humans built theirs from stories. Each unit became a myth, every fallen soldier a symbol. They didn't fight for victory, they fought to be remembered. And that made them impossible to erase. Cavell asked to access primary footage from the final known human deployment. His request triggered a protocol breach investigation. Yet once opened, it could not be closed. More students demanded access. Word spread across interstellar campuses. The name, Ghost Division, became whispered not with fear but awe. Not because they were killers, but because they were mourned. Mourned by their enemies. Mourned by planets they saved. Mourned by species who didn't understand them but knew something sacred had been lost when they vanished from the battlefield. A formal review was requested by the Student Coalition of Galactic Ethics. They demanded the Council declassify all human war records and reassess the justification behind the ban. The Council denied it. Not because they lacked evidence, but because they knew what it would lead to. Recognition. And recognition meant reckoning. To acknowledge what the humans truly were would unravel the comfort of current history. Entire doctrines would collapse. The galaxy had built a narrative in which humans were too emotional, too dangerous. The truth, that their emotion made them effective in ways others couldn't replicate, would shatter that lie. So the students turned underground. Independent servers. Peer-to-peer data leaks. Audio archives disguised as simulation code. The truth spread not through revolution, but through remembrance. They didn't need to preach human superiority. They only needed to let others hear them. Letters, recordings, songs, yes, songs, composed in languages no longer spoken but preserved because of meaning, not syntax. The more they learned, the more they realized that the humans hadn't been erased from war because they were flawed. They had been removed because they reminded everyone else what war truly cost. And something changed. Alien cadets who once trained on sterile strategy began to ask new questions. What did it mean to fight for someone you loved? Why did humans often pause before killing? Why did they mourn their enemies? The cadets didn't become human. But they began to feel what the humans had tried to protect. That perhaps war wasn't about triumph or survival, but about not forgetting who you are while doing the unthinkable. Cavell led a small team to reconstruct a message archive believed lost during the council purges. Among the recovered fragments was a personal log from a human field officer. He had seen 3 of his closest friends die in a single hour. His log didn't document enemy formations or tactical failures. It documented a single line. "We can't win this with numbers. We win it by being the last to forget who we are." The alien students began to understand. The ban wasn't a safety measure. It was an act of fear of confronting the humanity they lacked. Because humans didn't simply fight wars. They carried memory into the fire. They brought grief as fuel. They turned horror into meaning. And for civilizations built on cold order, that was the one force they couldn't regulate. By the end of their research, one truth emerged across every language, every species: humanity was never banned for being too emotional. They were banned because, in war, they made others feel. And in a galaxy addicted to control, nothing was more dangerous than remembering the price of victory. The Council's decision had not gone uncontested within its own walls. In the years following humanity's exclusion from galactic war, a few dissenting voices, quiet, quickly silenced, had documented their fears in encrypted formats never intended to see daylight. These documents were discovered, not by rebel factions, but by disillusioned scholars deep within the Council's own archives. What they revealed wasn't just revisionist history, it was a coordinated attempt to erase an uncomfortable reality. The official reason for the ban was destabilizing emotional volatility. The real reason, buried in language couched in secrecy, was far simpler: humans made the other species question their own morality. The Council's internal records showed a pattern of behavior that horrified the academic reviewers now gaining access. Battle after battle, human intervention had not only shifted outcomes but had done so in ways that disrupted the foundational assumptions of war itself. In one case, a human medical corps had violated direct orders to rescue wounded enemy soldiers under fire. In another, human engineers had halted a planetary siege after discovering unarmed civilians in subterranean shelters, refusing to proceed until they were evacuated, despite the tactical costs. These were not anomalies. They were repeated consistently across theaters of war. Humans applied moral frameworks where none were expected. Alien war doctrine, refined over millennia, operated on cold calculus, acceptable losses, strategic sacrifice, and scalable command systems. Humans inserted conscience into command chains, not as an afterthought, but as a standard. This wasn't seen as noble. It was seen as disruptive, dangerous, contagious. The presence of humans on the battlefield made others hesitate. It introduced doubt. Soldiers who fought alongside them began to question orders. Civilians began to ask why human units protected them more fiercely than their own governments. Even enemy commanders began to show unexpected restraint after encountering human divisions. The Council could manage weapons. They couldn't manage empathy. It was the moment empathy became a variable in war that everything changed. The Council had long known that most wars were not won by strategy alone, but by endurance, morale, belief. And humans, despite their losses, despite their pain, believed. Not in domination, but in meaning, in memory, in holding the line not for territory, but for each other. This belief didn't fade with hardship. It intensified. And for a galaxy raised on detachment, this was both bewildering and contagious. Worse still for the Council was the effect humans had on their enemies. Species that had never shown remorse before began to request ceasefires. Occupied populations began citing human philosophy in their resistance. Whole battalions switched sides not because of ideology, but because they could no longer ignore the dissonance between what they were told and what they had witnessed. The Council realized it wasn't just human tactics that threatened stability, it was the human spirit. A spirit that refused to let war erase dignity. That refused to let survival become an excuse for cruelty. The final decision to ban humanity was made not in open session but behind closed doors, under the justification of Long-term galactic cohesion. The public was fed a narrative of instability, risk, and necessary precaution. But deep in restricted council logs, reviewers found a single phrase repeated across multiple reports: "They make us remember what we want to forget." Now that students and independent researchers had leaked this data into public channels, the cultural ripple began. No governments fell. No treaties were torn. But a new kind of silence spread, one born not of censorship, but of reflection. Across systems, monuments that had once celebrated clean victories now felt hollow. Combat simulators found themselves updated with optional, human logic modules, requested not for performance but for understanding. Cadets began to study not just how humans fought, but why they chose to. And for the first time in generations, the purpose of war itself came under question. Amid all this, the reappearance of an unmarked vessel near a forgotten combat zone reignited the conversation. It bore no insignia, transmitted no recognizable frequency. But its construction matched pre-ban human design. It made no demands, no announcements. It simply transmitted one message across open channels: "We never left. We simply hoped you'd learn." The message was not signed. It didn't need to be. Every species that had fought beside, against, or under humans recognized the tone. The council scrambled to frame the incident as a hoax. Independent astrophysicists confirmed the vessel's age, composition, and navigational patterns. It wasn't a hoax. It was a reminder. And in being one, it posed no threat, only a question. If the galaxy had truly evolved beyond war, why did it still silence those who had shown how to preserve compassion in its midst? Veterans from non-human armies began speaking publicly, some for the first time. They described moments when human soldiers shielded them from bombardments, shared rations during resource collapses, sang to calm frightened younglings in occupied cities. These stories had no place in official records because they didn't serve strategic doctrine. But they were real. And as they surfaced, they painted a picture not of idealized heroes, but of individuals who refused to let war define them. Humans hadn't been perfect. They had been flawed, scared, angry. But they had never stopped being aware. Aware of the cost. Aware of the faces behind orders. Aware of the lives erased with every command followed too blindly. The council remained silent as this wave of testimony grew. Their silence became its own kind of confirmation. Students, scholars, even soldiers began pushing for the declassification of all human war archives. Some wanted to study them. Others wanted to apologize. But most wanted to understand how a species so feared had come to be remembered not for brutality, but for their refusal to surrender their empathy. The truth became undeniable. Humanity had not been erased because they endangered others. They had been erased because they endangered narratives, the sanitized, hollow, convenient version of war that allowed it to continue without conscience. They had brought back blood, tears, songs, guilt, forgiveness. They had made war feel again. And the galaxy had not been ready. But now, the question had shifted. It was no longer about whether humans would return to war. It was about whether the galaxy could look itself in the mirror without them. Whether civilizations built on detachment could face the emotions they had buried for the sake of efficiency. Whether remembering the truth would hurt more than the lie had comforted. And in that space, between memory and myth, the legacy of humanity quietly reignited. Not as conquerors. Not as monsters. But as a mirror that still waited, patient, for the galaxy to see itself clearly for the first time. They thought it would fade, that time would wash away the inconvenient truths. But even silence leaves echoes. Years after the human ban, those echoes grew louder, not quieter. Not from governments or militaries, but from those who had been touched, changed, protected, or simply seen by a human in war. The stories spread, not in official reports or textbooks, but in songs, murals, whispered legends, and the names carved into memorials that bore no flags. They weren't about conquest. They were about sacrifice. About the ones who didn't leave their comrades behind. About the hands that held the wounded, no matter what species. About those who gave everything in places the galaxy had long forgotten. A young alien historian, barely out of academic probation, published a book that should have been ignored like all the others. But it wasn't. The title, asterisk. The ones who stood still. Asterisk. It wasn't about weapons or victories. It was about a pattern. Human soldiers who, in the middle of retreat or annihilation, had chosen to stay behind. Not for tactical reasons, but to give others a chance. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But the stories always ended the same way, with someone alive who remembered the face of a human who did not run. The book went viral. Not for its content, but for what it unlocked. Testimonies poured in, aliens who had carried guilt for years, who had been saved or shown mercy and told to never speak of it. Now they did. And once the first voice cracked the surface, thousands followed. Entire regions of space, once content with the myth of unstable Earthlings, began to doubt. Why were humans the only ones forbidden to defend themselves? Why did the Council suppress the records of every conflict they participated in? Why were their dead so often unmarked, unnamed? The pressure built until one small system, unaligned and insignificant on the galactic scale, made a decision that shifted everything. They honored a human soldier with a public memorial. No politics. Just a name. Just truth. Within weeks, other systems followed. A movement began, quiet but impossible to stop, remembrance without permission. The Council tried to shut it down. Sanctions. Broadcast restrictions. Threats of destabilization. None of it worked. The more they tried to erase, the more the galaxy remembered. Not because humans were flawless, but because they were present. They didn't fight because they were ordered to. They fought because they felt the reasons. They suffered, bled, and died because they understood the value of the lives behind the lines. They didn't wage perfect wars. But they waged them honestly, aware of every cost. And that, more than anything, was what others couldn't forget. One day, a message arrived, not from Earth, but from an off-grid human relay that had never responded to any post-band transmissions. It contained a single question, asterisk. Have you healed yet? Asterisk. It was not followed by ships or ultimatums. Just silence. But it stirred something that no invasion ever had. The question echoed across forums, diplomatic chambers, and late-night conversations. It wasn't about military might. It was about readiness, not for battle, but for truth. Were they finally ready to face what had been done? Not just to humans, but to their own ideals? The Council didn't answer. They couldn't. Because to answer would be to admit they had silenced the very species that had reminded them what it meant to be more than conquerors. But the people answered. In classrooms, on comms, through stories. In one system, a former military commander rewrote his academy's entire training program to include human strategic compassion as a core discipline. In another, alien students began holding remembrance vigils not just for human lives, but for meaning lost in sanitized warfare. And in the quiet places of the stars, where battles once raged, alien veterans began placing small tokens, pieces of Earth tech, human flags, even handwritten notes. Not for glory. For closure. For Earth, the ban had never been about weakness. It had been a form of exile disguised as control. They had known it, and they had chosen not to fight it with missiles, but with time. With hope. They had waited, not because they were powerless, but because they had already seen what unchecked war did to the soul. They had made mistakes, yes. But they had chosen not to let those mistakes define their future. They gave the galaxy a chance to grow. Not out of fear. Out of mercy. Now, generations later, the final truth settled in, not in declarations, but in understanding. The galaxy realized it had feared humanity not for their strength, but for their capacity to care in the most dangerous of places. In the middle of horror, they had remembered kindness. In the face of annihilation, they had chosen to protect strangers. And most terrifying of all, they had done it not because someone told them to, but because it was right. And so the end wasn't a battlefield, or a council vote, or a final broadcast. It was a moment. A quiet one. A group of alien children gathered around an old screen, watching recovered footage of a human soldier carrying a wounded enemy to safety, refusing to let him die alone. The room was silent. And then, one child asked, "Why did he do that?" The teacher, tears barely hidden, replied, "Because he could." And that was it. That moment would ripple farther than any warhead. It would rewrite training manuals. It would inspire peace accords. It would remind an entire galaxy that the true power of a species was not how it fought, but how it remembered. And as that memory spread, as stars once scarred by conflict now bore the names of those who stood still when all else fell apart, the galaxy finally understood: humans had not been banned because they were broken. They had been banned because they could not be controlled. And in the end, that was their greatest gift, not victory, not dominance, but the inconvenient, stubborn, human refusal to forget what made life worth saving. They didn't return as conquerors. They didn't need to. They had already changed everything.